Well, students, thanks for joining me. Today I have as my special guest Elissa Scott, who is the Summary Crime Program Manager at Legal Aid. Elissa, thanks for joining me.
Pleasure.
Well, just give us a brief background as to your history, because it's very interesting. You're a social worker and a lawyer.
That's correct. So after high school, I decided I wanted to do social work. I didn't get the marks for law and I wasn't too concerned about it at that point. So I embarked on a social work journey, finished my social work degree and then actually asked to transfer across to law. So I studied law while I was working full-time as a social worker and mainly worked within the areas of children and adolescent mental health and then later on in the education department. So it was really interesting. But I still felt this kind of calling to the law. So I finished my law degree, although at times sometimes questioned why I was doing law, and then got articles at a commercial law firm. And commercial law for me just was not the go. It felt like a square peg in a round hole and couldn't wait to get out. So I stayed there for about 18 months before leaving and then basically falling into a criminal law job. So worked in the private sector for about 5 or 6 years and then moved to legal aid about 7.5 years ago now.
Okay, so multidisciplinary practices, they seem to be the buzzword at the moment. Can you explain to us exactly what a multidisciplinary practice is and why it works so well?
Sure. I think they can be different things in different settings, but for me they really are about having a number of different professions working together to assist a person. So we could be looking at different professions like a financial counsellor, drug and alcohol counsellor, psychologists, social workers, lawyers, and sometimes even medical professions like people like dentists, because it's really interesting how your teeth can really impact on whether you can get employment. So even employment workers, there's lots of different people that can come together to really look at a problem from a holistic point of view rather than just in isolation, because we know that legal problems in particular don't just surface on their own. They're usually in combination with a number of different things.
Okay, so most of the students watching this are law students. What can lawyers learn from social workers?
I think probably quite a lot. Clearly in social work we do lots of study around communication, mediation, and basically how to really get people on board and to understand what's going on for them. I think sometimes as lawyers we overlook that. We're trying to just think of the legal problem, but in fact the legal problem doesn't exist if it wasn't for that person. So social workers are great in terms of being able to really help us understand and be empathetic, and I think that's what they really bring and they can really add to a legal profession.
Well, I think most students would understand the importance of having people's issues dealt with in a holistic way, and social workers working alongside lawyers, great thing. But what about, and this is probably a bit of a technical issue, but what about the issue of professional privilege and legal professional privilege, particularly if you've got social workers getting the same sort of information as lawyers?
I think it can be a really tricky space to work within. I think social workers generally tend to work within the best interests of the client. Lawyers work in what are my instructions, so they sometimes cannot marry up. So it's really important that lawyers in particular are continually talking to their clients in a bit of a different way to say, look, it might be important for us to divulge this type of information because therapeutically that might help you shift. But it's always, from a legal point of view, it's really remembering to get those instructions and get that permission from the client to divulge something, and then to really advocate in that space for the clients, because sometimes social workers or psychologists or drug and alcohol counsellors will push back and say, well, I need to know more about what's going on for that person. But a lawyer's role in that is really to say, I need to get permission before I can divulge anything, and then to explain to the client why it is really important for some of that information to come out, because therapeutically that will be better for them in the long term.
And we've just had the Royal Commission on Family Violence released here in Victoria, and family violence really is core business of all courts on a daily basis. What special skills do you think lawyers need in dealing with family violence matters?
I actually think it's probably a real matter of having courage in that space. We do a lot of work with respondents where I am at Legal Aid, and it's really interesting that we have to have the courage to sometimes call things for what we see. Sometimes we work with people who are very much into blaming somebody else for the reason that they've got into the position that they're in, and having the courage sometimes to say, look, I'm going to assist you with your legal problem and I'm going to make sure that we offer you the best possible service. But having the courage to say, but sometimes in that space your behaviour was not okay, and it's about accepting responsibility for some of that. That can be a really challenging conversation, I think, for lawyers to have, particularly if they haven't had some of that social work training. But it's about not colluding with clients, and it's about saying there's another side to this story as well. It's about accepting responsibility for behaviour. Okay, now tell the truth, and I know you will because you're a lawyer. Probably a hard question, but which part of your work do you like the best? The social work aspect or the legal aspect? I think for me, I would call myself a people lawyer. So if you asked me to argue about a certain line in legislation, I would probably roll my eyes and go, oh, do I really have to? It's the technical legal side of things that I don't enjoy the most. What I do like though is working with the clients to try and help them get the best possible outcome from a legal point of view. So I think that's how I see myself, more of a practical lawyer than a real technical lawyer.
And last question, if you had one piece of advice for our students, what piece of advice would that be?
I think if you're working within the type of sector that I work within, in terms of working with people who face very complex issues day in, day out, it's about, and it might sound trite on some level, but it's actually about holding on to those stories of hope. We quite often work with people in crisis, and every day we're faced with that. We're faced with quite a negative environment. We deal with people who are, have got a lot of issues, but sometimes actually holding on to those stories of hope that in fact things can get better for those people really gives us the strength to continue in the work we do. But it's about being empathetic, and it's also about, I think, developing those skills of empathy, but at the same time also knowing when to put up your boundaries and knowing when to take that step back and to actually look after yourself. Now sometimes as lawyers, particularly when you're first starting out, you get drawn into thinking I've got to help solve everybody's problems, and we can't. That's the reality of it. So understanding that it's really healthy to actually step back sometimes and go, I need some time for me and some space, and I need to perhaps utilise some things that social workers do, like debriefing, to really help me have some longevity in that space.
Well, there you go, students. There's some great advice. Hang on to that glimmer of hope on behalf of your client, but don't think that you have to try and resolve every aspect of every part of your client's issues. Thanks very much, Elissa. And can I say, multidisciplinary practices are the way of the future. We're about to open a multidisciplinary practice here at RMIT to deal with people's issues in a holistic way. Get involved.